Before we talk about kings, wars or iron, we need to talk about trees, because for most of human history, forests were not just scenery, they were strategy. If you want to understand how societies survived shortages, built power and planned for collapse without ever writing it down, you have to understand why some trees were ruthlessly cut down, while others were guarded like treasure. If you value this kind of grounded material history, make sure you subscribe to Iron Age Instincts now, because this channel exists for people who want to understand how the past actually worked, not how it's romantically remembered. Why trees were never just trees to pre-industrial societies. In a world without fossil fuels, trees were energy, infrastructure, weapons, shelter, food security, and long-term insurance. Different species served radically different purposes, and cutting the wrong tree at the wrong time could weaken an entire region. Medieval communities, Iron Age cultures, and even early modern states understood something we've largely forgotten. Forests are not uniform. Oak, ash, pine, yew, willow and birch all had specific roles, and people learned through hard experience which ones to harvest aggressively and which ones to preserve at all costs. This wasn't environmentalism, it was survival math. Why fast-growing trees were cut early and often? Fast-growing species like birch, poplar, alder and willow were the workhorses of daily life. They regenerated quickly, burned hot, and could be coppiced repeatedly without killing the tree. Villages relied on them for firewood, charcoal production, fencing, baskets, tool handles and temporary structures. These trees were deliberately cut on cycles, sometimes every 5 to 10 years, because letting them overgrow actually reduced usable output. From a practical standpoint, this is still applicable today. If you're managing land for fuel or materials, fast-growing species should be treated as renewable assets. Controlled cutting increases productivity, reduces disease, and prevents overcrowding. Historical coppicing systems were sophisticated, even without written plans. Why slow-growing hardwoods were protected for generations? Oak is the clearest example. Oak took decades, sometimes centuries, to mature, but once mature, it provided unmatched strength, durability, and resistance to rot. Ships, bridges, fortifications, wagons, grain stores and heavy beams all depended on oak. Losing mature oaks meant losing future military and economic capacity. That's why many societies protected oak forests through custom, law and even religious taboo. In medieval England, cutting oak without permission could result in severe punishment. Not because rulers loved trees, but because they understood timelines. You could burn birch this winter. You needed oak 50 years from now. The practical lesson here is long-term planning under scarcity. If you're thinking in terms of resilience, some resources must be off-limits to short-term needs. Protecting slow-growing assets is how societies outlast crises. Now, why were certain trees protected for military reasons, you might wonder? Well, yew trees, for example, were protected almost obsessively in some parts of Europe. And the reason was actually quite simple. Longbows. Yew had, you see, the perfect balance of compression and tension for making bow staves. Once gunpowder came onto the scene, yew protection declined. But for centuries it was a truly strategic resource. Entire churchyards were even planted with yew specifically to ensure a steady supply. Meanwhile, pine and fir forests were protected near shipbuilding regions, because straight, tall trunks were absolutely essential for masts. States would actually mark certain trees generations in advance, and cutting them down early was considered, well, sabotage. This all tells us something rather important. Strategic materials don't have to be rare to be critical. They just need to be, irreplaceable within a useful time frame. So, why were fruit and nut trees almost always spared? Apple, pear, walnut, chestnut and olive trees were, well, food systems, not just ordinary plants. Cutting them meant destroying not just calories, but trade goods, animal fodder, and honestly, the long-term stability of entire communities. In many regions, there were even laws protecting fruit trees, even during times of warfare. Armies could take the fruit, sure, but they were strictly forbidden to cut the trees themselves. Chestnut forests, for instance, fed entire populations in parts of Europe. Walnuts provided oil, timber, and a good source of protein. Olive trees now, they took decades to mature and centuries to reach their peak productivity. Destroying them basically meant condemning the next generation to hardship. For those of us today who are, a bit survival-minded, this really reinforces a key idea. Calorie-producing systems are far more valuable than just raw materials. You burn wood once, but you can harvest food trees every single year. Now, why were sacred and boundary trees left untouched? Some trees were protected because they marked boundaries, burial grounds, or sacred spaces. This wasn't just superstition, at least not in the modern sense. It was, in fact, a kind of social technology. A tree tied to ritual or taboo was a tree no one dared cut, even in times of real hardship. That meant it survived famine, war, and population pressure. Boundary trees marked land rights, while sacred groves actually preserved biodiversity. Both served as stabilizing anchors in chaotic times. The practical takeaway here is pretty simple. If you want something protected when resources get tight, attach social or cultural meaning to it. History shows, quite plainly, that this works better than rules alone. So, this knowledge wasn't just stumbled upon by accident. These systems weren't guesswork, they were learned, refined, and, importantly, enforced. Communities tracked regrowth cycles, lords maintained what were called forest rolls. Monasteries even planned timber use centuries ahead. And, when societies ignored these rules, well, deforestation followed, along with famine, flooding, and collapse. You can actually apply this thinking today by categorizing resources by regeneration speed, strategic value, and replacement time. Fast-growing gets used, slow-growing gets guarded, food-producing gets priority, and strategic materials, well, they get planned out decades ahead. Forgetting this knowledge, honestly, always comes at a cost. Every historical deforestation crisis follows the same old pattern. Short-term extraction overrides long-term planning, protected trees get cut, regeneration is ignored. The consequences, of course, arrive later, when it's really too late to reverse them. Iron Age and medieval societies weren't primitive, they were constrained. And within those constraints, they developed forest management systems that, frankly, modern societies often fail to match. Understanding why certain trees were cut down and others protected isn't about nostalgia. It's a lesson in disciplined thinking under pressure. So, if this kind of grounded, survival-oriented history matters to you, subscribe to Iron Age Instincts, share this video with someone who still thinks history is just dates and battles, and above all, keep this knowledge alive.